The Manson Family, a historical documentary. Prelude to Darkness. Los Angeles on August 9th, 1969, casting long shadows across Benedict Canyon. The city was already awake, already moving, already alive with the rhythm of another summer day in Hollywood. But at 10050 Cielo Drive, nestled in the hills above the glittering sprawl of the city, something terrible had happened in the darkness. Something that would shatter the illusion of safety that had blanketed America like a comfortable dream. Something that would mark the end of an era and the beginning of a new and uncertain age. Penetrating Grid Chapman arrived for work that morning, as she always did, a housekeeper making her way up the winding driveway to the residence where she had worked for months. The house belonged to film director Roman Polanski and his wife, the actress Sharon Tate, though Polanski was away in London working on a film. Chapman had no reason to expect anything unusual, no reason to feel the cold dread that would soon grip her heart. But as she approached the property, she noticed something wrong. The line to the gate had been cut. Strange. Then she saw the car in the driveway, and through its windows, a sight that would haunt her forever. She ran. She ran down the driveway, past the gate, down the hill, screaming for help. Neighbors called the police. Within minutes, officers from the Los Angeles Police Department arrived at the scene, and what they discovered inside the house and on its grounds would become one of the most notorious crime scenes in American history. 5 people were dead. The brutality of what had occurred was almost beyond comprehension, the violence so extreme that even seasoned homicide detectives found themselves shaken. On the front door, written in the blood of one of the victims, was a single word that offered no explanation, only more questions. Pig. The victims were identified over the coming hours. Sharon Tate, 26 years old and 8.5 months pregnant, had been one of Hollywood's rising stars. Jay Sebring, a celebrity hairstylist who had revolutionized men's grooming and counted Frank Sinatra among his clients. Abigail Folger, heiress to the Folger coffee fortune and a dedicated civil rights worker. Wojciech Frykowski, an aspiring screenwriter and friend of Roman Polanski. Stephen Parent, just 18 years old, who had been visiting the property's caretaker and was in the wrong place at the worst possible time. News of the murders spread through Hollywood like wildfire, igniting a panic that would grip the entertainment industry and the city beyond. If Sharon Tate could be murdered in her own home, a home protected by gates and nestled in an exclusive neighborhood, then who was safe? The randomness of it, the savagery of it, created a climate of fear unlike anything Los Angeles had experienced. Gun stores reported a surge in sales. Security companies were overwhelmed with requests. Celebrities hired bodyguards and installed sophisticated alarm systems. Something dark had entered the dream factory, and no one knew who or what it was, or why it had come. The investigation began immediately, but the detectives working the case had no clear leads, no obvious motive, no suspects. The crime scene yielded some evidence, fingerprints and other traces, but without someone to match them to, they meant little. The newspapers ran headlines that spoke of ritualistic killings, of drug-crazed madness, of a city under siege. But the truth, when it finally emerged, would prove stranger and more disturbing than any of the early speculation. The truth would reveal not a random act of violence, but a carefully orchestrated series of murders carried out by a group of young people under the influence of a charismatic ex-convict who believed he could spark an apocalyptic race war. But understanding how such a thing could happen, understanding how ordinary young people from middle-class backgrounds could be transformed into killers, requires going back further. It requires examining the life of the man who would orchestrate these crimes, a man whose childhood was marked by abandonment and whose adult life was spent either behind bars or manipulating those around him. It requires understanding the cultural moment of the late 1960s, when traditional values were being questioned and young people were searching for meaning in a world that seemed to be falling apart. And it requires acknowledging the vulnerability of those who would become his followers. young women searching for belonging and finding instead a nightmare from which they could not escape. The morning of August 9th, 1969, was not just the beginning of a murder investigation. It was the beginning of a national reckoning, a moment when America would have to confront uncomfortable truths about itself, about the dark possibilities lurking beneath the surface of the counterculture, about the ease with which charisma can be weaponized and idealism can be corrupted. The house at 10050 Cielo Drive became a symbol, a monument to lost innocence, a place where the dreams of the 1960s died in blood and terror. A life of abandonment. Charles Mills Manson was born on November 12, 1934, in Cincinnati, Ohio, to Kathleen Maddox, a 16-year-old girl who was utterly unprepared for motherhood. His birth certificate listed his name as No Name Maddox initially, a detail that would later seem prophetic, as if, even from the beginning, he was a child without identity or belonging. His biological father was believed to be Colonel Walker Henderson Scott, though Colonel was a given name rather than a military rank, and Scott would play no role in the boy's life. Shortly after his birth, Kathleen married William Manson, a laborer, and the infant was given the surname that would become infamous. But the marriage was troubled from the start, and William Manson would file for divorce in 1937, citing gross neglect of duty by Kathleen. Laughing was young and troubled, with babysitters while she went on drinking binges with her brother Luther. She was not cruel by intention, but she was incapable of providing the stability and care that a child needs to develop a healthy sense of self and security. In 1939, when Charles was 5 years old, Kathleen and Luther robbed a man in Charleston, West Virginia. The crime was poorly executed, and within hours both were arrested. Kathleen was sentenced to 5 years in prison, and Charles was sent to live with an aunt and uncle in McMecken, West Virginia. For a brief period, life stabilized. His aunt and uncle provided structure and care, and years later, Manson would describe this time as relatively peaceful compared to what came before and after. But in 1942, Kathleen was paroled, and she came to retrieve her son. Manson later characterized the first weeks after her release as the happiest time in his life, a glimpse of what a relationship with his mother might have been. But the happiness was short-lived. The family moved to Charleston, then to Indianapolis, and Kathleen remarried. She continued drinking, and Charles began to act out, playing truant from school and stealing from local shops. By 1947, Kathleen had reached the end of her ability to cope with her increasingly troublesome son. She attempted to have him placed in foster care, but instead he was made a ward of the state and sent to the Gibault School for Boys, a Catholic institution in Terre Haute, Indiana, for delinquent children. He was 13 years old, and his childhood, such as it had been, was effectively over. At Gibault, he ran away multiple times, always attempting to return to his mother, always being rejected or sent back. In 1948, he was transferred to a more secure facility, and in 1951, at age 16, he escaped again and embarked on a series of burglaries and car thefts that would lead to his first serious criminal charges. Because he had driven a stolen car across state lines, the crime became federal, and Manson found himself in the custody of federal authorities at an age when most teenagers are learning to drive and preparing for their first jobs. He was sent to various federal reformatories, institutions designed to rehabilitate juvenile offenders, but which often served only to harden them. In 1952, while incarcerated, he reportedly raped another inmate at knife point, an act that demonstrated the capacity for violence that would later define his legacy. He continued to commit various offenses, and though there were periods of good behavior that earned him early releases, he never managed to stay out of trouble for long. In 1954, at age 19, he was released and went to live with his aunt and uncle in West Virginia. Within months, he had married Rosalie Jean Willis, a hospital waitress, and the couple moved to California. But Manson could not leave his criminal habits behind. By 1956, his probation had been revoked after he failed to appear at a hearing, and he was sentenced to 3 years at Terminal Island in California. While he was in prison, Rosalie gave birth to their son, Charles Manson Jr., but the marriage was already over. Rosalie would eventually divorce him, and Manson would have virtually no contact with his son, repeating the pattern of abandonment that had defined his own childhood. Throughout the 1950s and early 60s, Manson cycled in and out of prison, serving time for offenses ranging from check forgery to pimping. By the time he was 32 years old, he had spent more than half his life in correctional institutions. But prison was not wasted time for Manson, at least not in the sense of personal development. He was a keen observer of human behavior, and he learned to manipulate the systems and people around him. He studied Scientology, which gave him a vocabulary for discussing the mind and behavior. He took Dale Carnegie courses on leadership and influence, designed to help inmates reintegrate into society, but which Manson used to hone his ability to read people and tell them what they wanted to hear. He also developed musical aspirations. In prison, fellow inmate Alvin Karpis, a notorious bank robber, taught him to play the steel guitar. Manson became obsessed with music, seeing it as a potential path to the fame and acceptance he craved. He watched from behind bars as the Beatles rose to international stardom, and he became convinced that he could achieve similar success if only he were given the chance. Music was not just a hobby for Manson, it was a core part of his identity and his plan for the future. He believed he had talent, believed he had something important to say, and believed that the world would eventually recognize his genius. In March 1967, Manson was released from federal prison in Terminal Island, California. By this point, he had spent so much of his life institutionalized that he was more comfortable behind bars than outside them. According to prison reports, he actually asked if he could remain in prison, saying he had no plans for release and nowhere to go. The request was denied, and Manson found himself on the streets of California at age 32, a man with virtually no experience of normal adult life, no legitimate job skills, no stable relationships, and no clear path forward. But what he did have was an understanding of manipulation, a gift for reading people and exploiting their vulnerabilities, and an unshakable belief in his own importance. These tools would serve him well in the chaotic cultural landscape he was about to enter. His parole officer, Roger Smith, was a graduate student in criminology who saw Manson as an interesting case study rather than a threat. Smith supervised Manson loosely, allowing him freedoms that other parolees might not have enjoyed. This permissive oversight would have catastrophic consequences, as it allowed Manson to begin gathering followers without interference from the authorities, who might have stopped him before his influence could grow dangerous. Manson moved to Berkeley, then to San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district, arriving just as the Summer of Love was beginning to transform the city into the epicenter of the counterculture movement. The Summer of Love and the birth of a family. San Francisco in the spring and summer of 1967 was unlike anything America had seen before. The Haight-Ashbury district had become a mecca for young people from across the country who were searching for alternatives to the mainstream American lifestyle their parents had built. They came seeking peace, love, community, and expanded consciousness through music, art, and psychedelic drugs. The Human Be-In had drawn tens of thousands to Golden Gate Park in January, and by summer, the population of Haight-Ashbury had swelled with an estimated 100,000 young people, many of them runaways or dropouts who had rejected conventional paths in favor of communal living and experimentation. Into this scene walked Charles Manson, an ex-convict with a guitar and a gift for manipulation. He was physically small, standing only 5 feet 2 inches tall, but he possessed an intensity and charisma that drew people to him. He had learned in prison how to present himself as whatever others needed him to be: a guru, a friend, a father figure, a lover. He understood that the young people flooding into Haight-Ashbury were searching for meaning and belonging, and he positioned himself as someone who could provide both. He preached a philosophy that mixed elements of Scientology, the Bible, Dale Carnegie's techniques for winning friends, and the emerging hippie ethos of free love and rejection of societal norms. His first follower was Mary Brunner, a library assistant at the University of California, Berkeley. She was 23 years old, lonely and vulnerable, and Manson recognized these qualities immediately. He moved into her apartment, and within weeks, he had convinced her to allow other young women to join them. The pattern was established. Manson would meet young women who were lost or searching, usually at bus stations or on the streets, and he would offer them acceptance and belonging. He told them they were beautiful, that they were special, that he understood them in ways no one else did. For many of these young women, who had difficult relationships with their parents or had experienced trauma, Manson's attention was intoxicating. By summer, Manson had attracted a group of followers, mostly young women in their late teens and early 20s, who began to see him as a spiritual leader. They lived together in a house at 636 Cole Street in Haight-Ashbury, just 2 blocks from the headquarters of the Process Church of the Final Judgment, a cult from which Manson may have borrowed some of his apocalyptic ideas. The household operated on Manson's rules. He controlled sexual relationships, deciding who would sleep with whom and when. He encouraged drug use, particularly LSD, as a means of breaking down the followers' resistance and creating a shared reality in which he was the ultimate authority. He gave the women new names, erasing their former identities and binding them more closely to him and to the group. Manson's message was a strange amalgam of love and violence, peace and apocalypse. He spoke about breaking free from societal conditioning, about experiencing true freedom, about the coming changes that would transform the world. He presented himself as a Christ-like figure, someone who had been rejected and persecuted, but who possessed special knowledge about the nature of reality and the future of humanity. To his followers, many of whom were using drugs regularly and living in a state of intentional detachment from mainstream society, Manson's teachings seemed profound. They saw not a manipulative ex-convict, but a misunderstood prophet. Among the young people who joined the group in these early months were Susan Atkins, who had been living on the streets after leaving home, and Patricia Krenwinkel, who had driven to California from Alabama and found herself adrift in the unfamiliar landscape of the counterculture. Atkins was 18 years old when she met Manson, and she later described feeling as if he could see into her soul, as if he understood her in ways her own father never had. Krenwinkel was similarly captivated, seeing in Manson a father figure and a guide who offered the acceptance she had always craved. Both women would become central figures in the murders that would occur 2 years later. Manson was also pursuing his musical ambitions during this time. He played guitar on street corners and in parks, singing songs he had written in prison and developing new material. His music was not particularly sophisticated, but it had a raw, folk quality that some found appealing in the context of the times. Through chance and persistence, Manson made connections in the Los Angeles music scene, most notably with Dennis Wilson, the drummer for the Beach Boys, one of the most successful rock bands in America. The meeting with Dennis Wilson in the spring of 1968 seemed like the break Manson had been waiting for. Wilson picked up 2 of Manson's female followers hitchhiking, and when he returned home later that evening, he found Manson and the entire group had moved into his mansion in Pacific Palisades. Rather than calling the police or evicting them, Wilson was intrigued. He was drawn to the free love philosophy and the unconventional lifestyle the group represented. He allowed them to stay, and for several months, the Manson family lived at Wilson's expense, eating his food, using his cars, and running up bills that eventually totaled tens of thousands of dollars. Through Wilson, Manson met Terry Melcher, a successful record producer who was also the son of actress and singer Doris Day. Melcher lived at 10050 Cielo Drive in Benedict Canyon with his girlfriend, actress Candice Bergen, and musician Mark Lindsay. Manson visited the house multiple times and auditioned his music for Melcher. Initially, Melcher expressed some interest in possibly recording Manson, or making a documentary about the family and their communal lifestyle. Manson allowed himself to believe that fame and success were finally within reach, that his talent would be recognized, and he would achieve the status he had always felt he deserved. But Melcher's interest waned. After witnessing Manson fighting violently with a drunk stuntman at Spahn Ranch, Melcher decided that Manson was too unstable and unpredictable to work with. He stopped returning calls and made it clear, though perhaps not directly enough, that there would be no record deal and no documentary. Manson was furious. He had been rejected again, this time in the arena that mattered most to him. The rejection festered, turning into resentment and rage that would later play a role in the selection of targets for the murders. Dennis Wilson also eventually distanced himself from Manson, though not before recording one of Manson's songs, Cease to Exist, which Wilson altered and released as Never Learn Not to Love, on the B-side of a Beach Boys single. Wilson received sole writing credit, which infuriated Manson even more. He felt betrayed, stolen from, denied the recognition he deserved. These feelings of rejection and betrayal would become part of the psychological landscape that led to the violence in August 1969. By mid-1968, the family had moved to Spahn Ranch, a former movie set in the Santa Susana Mountains, northwest of Los Angeles. The ranch had been used for Western films and television shows, but by the late 60s, it was run down and generated income primarily from horseback riding tours. The owner, George Spahn, was nearly blind and in his 80s. Manson assigned one of his followers, Lynette Fromm, who acquired the nickname Squeaky, to serve as Spahn's caretaker and companion. In exchange, the family was allowed to live on the property rent-free. At Spahn Ranch, isolated from the outside world and immersed in Manson's teachings, the group's dynamics intensified. New members arrived, including Charles "Tex" Watson, a small-town Texan who had dropped out of college and drifted to California. Watson was intelligent and capable, and Manson groomed him to be a leader within the group. Leslie Van Houten, a middle-class girl from Southern California, also joined, drawn by the promise of love and belonging. The family's daily life revolved around Manson, who controlled every aspect of their existence. They worked on the ranch, took drugs together, and participated in what Manson called group sessions, where he would preach his evolving philosophy. Proportional was becoming darker and more apocalyptic. Manson began speaking more frequently about an impending race war, which he called Helter, Skelter, taking the name from a song on the Beatles' White Album. He became obsessed with the Beatles, believing that they were sending coded messages specifically to him through their music. He interpreted the lyrics of songs like Helter Skelter, Revolution 9, and Blackbird as prophecies of a coming apocalypse in which Black Americans would rise up and slaughter whites. According to Manson's twisted vision, when the war was over, he and the family would emerge from hiding in the desert, where they would have waited out the violence, and take control of what remained of civilization. This delusion was not entirely original to Manson. He had borrowed from various sources, including the Book of Revelation, the Process Church, and the racial tensions that were very real in late 1960s America. The civil rights movement had transformed the country, but it had also created backlash and fear among some white Americans. Urban riots had erupted in multiple cities. The assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in April 1968 had intensified anger and grief in black communities. Manson took these real tensions and twisted them into a paranoid fantasy in which he was the central figure, the chosen one who would rule in the aftermath. Kudiek his followers that they needed to do something to trigger Helter Skelter, to start the race war that he believed was inevitable. The Beatles, he said, had called out to him specifically, and it was his responsibility to answer that call. His followers, many of them young women who had been with him for over a year and were thoroughly indoctrinated, believed him without question. They had surrendered their critical thinking, their connection to their families, their previous identities. Manson was their reality, and his word was absolute. Helter, Skelter, a delusion takes shape. The Beatles' White Album was released in November 1968, and for Charles Manson, it became a sacred text, a collection of hidden messages that confirmed everything he believed about himself and his destiny. He played the album obsessively at Spahn Ranch, gathering his followers around and explaining what the songs really meant, decoding lyrics that he insisted contained instructions meant specifically for him. To anyone outside the group, Manson's interpretations were transparently delusional. But within the insular world of the family, his words carried the weight of divine revelation. The song Helter, Skelter was originally written by Paul McCartney as a loud, chaotic rock song meant to compete with the heavy sounds emerging from other bands. McCartney would later explain that it was about a playground slide, a spiral descent that he associated with wildness and fun. But to Manson, the song was about the coming apocalypse, a descent into racial chaos that would consume America. He told his followers that the song was the Beatles' way of telling them that the time was approaching, that they needed to be ready. Revolution 9, an experimental track on the album filled with sound collages and spoken fragments, became another key piece of Manson's apocalyptic puzzle. He heard in its chaotic layers confirmation of his race war prophecy. Blackbird, which McCartney had written as a message of support for the civil rights movement, was interpreted by Manson as the Beatles telling Black Americans to rise up and start the revolution. Every song seemed to Manson to contain hidden meanings, and he wove them together into a narrative in which he was the central prophet, the one who understood what was really happening and what needed to be done. The fact that the Beatles themselves would have been horrified by Manson's interpretations, that the messages he heard were entirely products of his own disturbed mind, never occurred to his followers. They had been conditioned to accept Manson's word as truth, and they had been using LSD and other drugs so regularly that their ability to think critically had been severely compromised. They were living in a constructed reality where Manson's delusions made sense, where the idea of an apocalyptic race war seemed not insane, but inevitable. By early 1969, Manson's frustration with the music industry had reached a boiling point. Terry Melcher had definitively rejected him. Dennis Wilson had distanced himself. Record companies showed no interest in his music, despite his efforts to get his songs heard. Manson had been convinced that his musical talent would bring him fame and recognition, but instead he had been dismissed and ignored. In his mind, these rejections were not just personal disappointments, but cosmic injustices, evidence that the world was too blind and corrupt to recognize his genius. The bitterness he felt fused with his apocalyptic beliefs, creating a volatile mixture of resentment and grandiosity. Manson told his followers that the Beatles were waiting for him to start Helter Skelter, that he needed to show them how it was done. Black Americans, he said, would not know how to properly start the revolution without guidance, and so it was necessary for the family to initiate the violence themselves, to show the way. This rationalization allowed him to frame murder not as a crime, but as a revolutionary act, a necessary step in bringing about the new world order he envisioned. In late July 1969, the family committed its first murder, though it was not yet part of the Helter Skelter plan. Gary Hinman was a music teacher and friend to some of the family members. He was a gentleman who had allowed several family members to stay at his home in Topanga Canyon and had tried to help them. But Manson believed, incorrectly, that Hinman had recently come into an inheritance and had money that could be taken. He sent Bobby Beausoleil, Mary Brunner, and Susan Atkins to Hinman's home to get the money and convince him to join the family. Hinman insisted he had no money and no inheritance. The situation deteriorated over 2 days, with the family members holding him hostage. Manson himself appeared at one point, slashing Hinman's face and ear with a sword in an attempt to intimidate him into compliance. When Hinman still maintained that he had no money to give them, Beausoleil stabbed him to death on Manson's instruction. Before leaving, they wrote, political piggy on the wall in Hinman's blood, hoping to make it look like the killing had been carried out by the Black Panthers or other radical groups. Beausoleil was arrested on August 6th while driving Hinman's car, which still contained the murder weapon. He was immediately identified as a suspect in the murder, and family members, particularly Manson, began to worry that the arrest would lead police back to the group. This fear may have been one factor in the decision to carry out the Tate and LaBianca murders, creating copycat crime scenes that might cast doubt on Beausoleil's guilt and suggest that the real killer was still at large. But the primary motivation, according to the evidence that would later be presented at trial, was Manson's desire to trigger Helter Skelter. He had been preaching about it for months, building it up as the inevitable next stage of history, and now he felt the time had come to act. The Beatles had called to him through their music, the world had rejected him, and his followers were waiting for him to lead them into the new age. In his twisted logic, committing horrific murders and making them look like the work of black militants would ignite the race war he had predicted, proving his prophetic powers and securing his place as the leader who would emerge victorious when the chaos subsided. The house at 10050 Cielo Drive had particular significance for Manson. It was where Terry Melcher had lived when he rejected Manson's music. Although Melcher had moved out earlier in 1969 and the house was now being rented by Roman Polanski and Sharon Tate, Manson either did not know this or did not care. The house represented his rejection, his failure to achieve the fame he felt he deserved, and it became the target for the rage and resentment that had been building within him. On the night of August 8, 1969, he would send 4 of his most devoted followers to that address with instructions to destroy everyone inside. 2 nights of terror. Of August 8, 1969, Charles Manson gathered several members of the family at Spahn Ranch and gave them their instructions. He told Charles Tex Watson to take Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian to the house at 10050 Cielo Drive and to kill everyone inside. According to Watson's later testimony, Manson's words were explicit and unambiguous. Go to the house and totally destroy everyone there, and do it as gruesome as possible. Manson told the women to do whatever Watson told them to do. The 4 of them left the ranch in a car as darkness settled over Los Angeles, driving toward Benedict Canyon with knives and a gun. Linda Kasabian was the newest member of the group, having joined the family only a few weeks earlier. She was 20 years old and had come to California searching for the sense of community and purpose that the counterculture seemed to promise. She had participated in the group's activities and had accepted Manson's teachings without fully understanding what she was being drawn into. On this night, she would serve as the lookout and would be the only one of the 4 who did not actively participate in the killing. Her horror at what she witnessed that night would eventually lead her to testify against the others, providing crucial evidence that would help secure their convictions. The car arrived at 10050 Cielo Drive shortly after midnight. Watson climbed a telephone pole and cut the wires to prevent anyone in the house from calling for help. Then he led the group onto the property. As they approached the main house, headlights appeared in the driveway. Stephen Parent, an 18-year-old who had been visiting William Garrettson, the caretaker who lived in a guest house on the property, was leaving to drive home. Watson approached the car, and when Parent asked what he wanted, Watson shot him 4 times, killing him instantly. It was a senseless, cold-blooded murder, the killing of someone who had no connection to the house's residents and who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong moment. Chase, the main house, Sharon Folger, and Wojciech Frykowski were spending a quiet evening together. Tate was 8.5 months pregnant and had been resting after having lunch with a friend earlier in the day. Her husband, Roman Polanski, was in London working on a film, and she was being kept company by Sebring, her former boyfriend who remained a close friend, and by Frykowski and Folger, who were house guests. None of them had any reason to expect violence. They were not involved in drugs or criminal activity. They were simply people living their lives, unaware that they had been targeted by someone they had never met for reasons that had nothing to do with them personally. Watson cut a screen and entered the house through a window, then opened the door for Atkins and Krenwinkel. What happened next was an eruption of violence that lasted for some time and demonstrated the complete absence of mercy or humanity in the attackers. The victims were bound, threatened, and then attacked with knives and the gun. Sebring was shot and stabbed when he tried to protect Tate. Frykowski managed to break free and run outside, but Watson chased him down, shooting and stabbing him repeatedly. Folger also tried to escape, making it outside onto the lawn, but Krenwinkel pursued her and brought her down with multiple knife wounds. Sharon Tate, seeing the horror unfolding around her, begged for her life and the life of her unborn child. She asked to be taken hostage, to be kept alive until she could give birth, offering anything if they would spare her baby. Her pleas were ignored. Susan Atkins would later brag to her cellmates about these final moments, about how Tate had cried for her mother, about how Atkins had told her that she had no mercy for her. The cruelty of these details, the absolute lack of compassion shown to a woman who was days away from giving birth, would shock the nation when they became public. Before leaving the scene, Atkins used a towel dipped in Sharon Tate's blood to write the word "pig" on the front door. The word was meant to suggest that the murders had been committed by black militants, part of Manson's plan to make the killings look like racial violence and thereby ignite Helter Skelter. The scene the killers left behind was one of utter devastation. A home transformed into a horror show. 5 people dead for no reason other than that a delusional ex-convict had decided their deaths would serve his apocalyptic fantasy. The 4 returned to Spahn Ranch in the early morning hours of August 9th. According to testimony, Manson asked if the killings had been Helter Skelter, and Watson confirmed that they had been. But Manson was reportedly dissatisfied with aspects of how the night had gone, particularly with the fact that the victims had panicked and fled rather than dying passively. He decided that another night of killing was necessary, that the violence needed to be more controlled, and the messages left behind needed to be clearer. On the night of August 9th, less than 24 hours after the Tate murders, Manson assembled another group for a second attack. This time, he included Leslie Van Houten, who had not participated in the first night, but who was eager to prove her devotion to Manson and the family. Manson himself came along on this night, directing the group to drive through Los Angeles looking for a target. They drove for some time before Manson directed them to 3301 Waverly Drive in the Los Feliz neighborhood, the home of Lino and Rosemary LaBianca. Lino LaBianca was a successful grocery store executive, and Rosemary was a businesswoman who ran a dress shop. They were a middle-class couple living in a nice neighborhood, and like the victims the previous night, they had no connection to Manson or the family. The choice of their home was essentially random, though. Manson claimed to have been to a house next door on a previous occasion. It did not matter to Manson who they were. They were simply targets, people whose deaths would add to the chaos and fear he was trying to create. Manson entered the house first, surprising the LaBiancas and binding them with cords. He assured them that they would not be hurt, that this was just a robbery. Then he left, taking Atkins, Kasabian, and another family member with him, and leaving Watson, Krenwinkel, and Van Houten to carry out the murders. The 3 who remained killed both Lino and Rosemary LaBianca in a sustained attack that demonstrated the same brutality that had characterized the previous night. After the victims were dead, the killers spent time in the house, taking showers, eating food from the refrigerator, playing with the couple's dogs. The casualness of their behavior after committing such violence speaks to how completely they had been indoctrinated into Manson's worldview, how thoroughly their normal human responses of horror and revulsion had been suppressed. Before leaving, they wrote messages on the walls and refrigerator in the victim's blood: "Death to pigs, rise," and misspelled Helter Skelter. They also left a fork protruding from Lino LaBianca's body. These messages and symbols were meant to continue the suggestion that the murders were part of a black militant uprising, though in reality, They simply added to the horror and confusion that would grip Los Angeles when the bodies were discovered. 2 nights, 7 people dead, and 3 more people who would carry the trauma of having witnessed or survived these events for the rest of their lives. The violence had been extreme, the cruelty absolute, and the randomness of the victim selection made the crimes even more terrifying. If successful, well-known people like Sharon Tate and ordinary middle-class people like the LaBiancas could be murdered in their own homes for no apparent reason, then no one was safe. The murders would send shockwaves through Los Angeles and through American culture more broadly, marking a turning point in the nation's understanding of itself and the era it was living through. The investigation. Piecing together the unthinkable. Because of the murders, the Los Angeles Police Department launched 2 separate investigations, unaware that the crimes were connected. The Tate murders in Benedict Canyon fell under the jurisdiction of LAPD's West Los Angeles Division, while the LaBianca murders in Los Feliz were being investigated by a different team. The similarities between the cases, the messages written in blood, and the general atmosphere of ritualistic violence should have suggested a connection. But communication between the 2 teams was limited, and each was pursuing its own leads. The Tate case immediately became headline news around the world. Sharon Tate's fame and her pregnancy made the story impossible to ignore, and the brutal nature of the crimes created a media frenzy unlike anything Hollywood had seen. Rumors spread rapidly, many of them false or exaggerated. Some reports suggested the crimes were connected to drug dealing, others to satanic cults or ritualistic practices. The police were overwhelmed with tips and theories, most of which led nowhere. The investigation was complicated by the chaos at the crime scene and by the fact that, initially, there were no obvious suspects and no clear motive. One crucial piece of evidence was discovered early, but not immediately recognized as significant. A gun was found by a young boy in the neighborhood and turned over to police, but in the confusion and volume of evidence being processed, it was not initially linked to the Tate murders. This oversight meant that a direct connection to the killers was sitting in evidence storage, while investigators chased other leads. On August 16, 1969, just a week after the LaBianca murders, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department raided Spahn Ranch as part of an investigation into car theft and the operation of a stolen vehicle ring. 26 people, including Charles Manson and several of the women who had participated in the murders, were arrested. This should have been the break in the case, but it was not. The search warrant had been misdated due to a clerical error, and the judge ruled it invalid. Everyone arrested in the raid was released within a few days, and the opportunity to stop the family before they could commit more violence was lost. After the raid, Manson became paranoid that the authorities were closing in on them. He decided to move the family to a more remote location, and they relocated to Barker Ranch and the nearby Myers Ranch in the Death Valley area. These locations were isolated and difficult to access, accessible only by rough desert roads. Manson believed they could hide there while preparing for Helter Skelter, and he began stockpiling supplies and converting stolen vehicles into dune buggies for desert travel. But local authorities in Inyo County, along with National Park Service rangers, were already aware of suspicious activity in the area. Vehicles had been stolen and vandalized, including a Michigan loader that had been set on fire on the racetrack playa in Death Valley National Monument. Investigators tracked the vandalism and thefts back to the area around Barker Ranch, and they began planning raids to arrest those responsible. On October 10 and October 12, 1969, law enforcement conducted 2 raids on Barker Ranch, arresting a total of 26 family members on charges including arson, grand theft auto, and vandalism. Charles Manson was found hiding in a cabinet beneath a bathroom sink, his long hair sticking out and giving away his position to the officer who was using the bathroom. At the time of his arrest, the Inyo County authorities had no idea who Manson really was or what crimes he and his followers had committed. They were focused on local property crimes and had no knowledge that they had captured the person responsible for some of the most notorious murders in California history. That connection would not be made for nearly 2 months. Susan Atkins, who had been arrested in the Barker Ranch raids, was transferred to Sybil Brand Institute, a women's detention facility, where she was housed while awaiting trial on the Hinman murder charge. There, she began talking to her cellmates, Virginia Graham and Ronnie Howard, bragging about the crimes the family had committed. At first, her cellmates thought she was making up stories to gain attention, but as Atkins provided more and more specific details, they realized she was telling the truth. She described the Tate murders in graphic detail, boasting about Sharon Tate's final moments, about the fear in her victims' eyes, about the power she had felt in taking their lives. Ronnie Howard was horrified by what she was hearing, and she made the decision to inform authorities. On November 17, 1969, she told her story to the Los Angeles Police Department, providing the breakthrough that investigators had been desperately seeking. Howard's information, combined with interviews of other family members and investigation of the Hinman murder, allowed police to begin piecing together the full scope of what had happened. Members of a motorcycle gang called the Straight Satans, who had associated with the family at Spahn Ranch, also provided information that helped connect Manson to the murders. By December 1, 1969, the Los Angeles Police Department was ready to announce that they had identified the suspects in the Tate and LaBianca murders. The announcement stunned the nation. The killers were not hardened criminals from the underworld or drug-crazed maniacs operating alone. They were a group of young people, mostly women from seemingly normal backgrounds, who had been living as hippies and who were under the influence of a charismatic cult leader named Charles Manson. The connection to the counterculture movement sent shockwaves through American society, confirming the worst fears of those who had been suspicious of hippies and the youth rebellion. Arrest warrants were issued, and over the following weeks, the suspects were located and taken into custody. Patricia Krenwinkel was found in Mobile, Alabama, staying with relatives. Leslie Van Houten and Susan Atkins were already in custody. Charles Tex Watson was arrested in Texas and would later be extradited to California for a separate trial. Linda Kasabian, who had fled the family shortly after the murders, was granted immunity in exchange for her testimony, which would prove crucial to the prosecution's case. The investigation had taken 4 months from the night of the murders to the identification of the suspects. But once the pieces came together, the case against Manson and his followers became overwhelming. Physical evidence from the crime scenes, including fingerprints and the gun used in the Tate murders, combined with the testimony of Kasabian and other witnesses, created a comprehensive picture of what had happened and who was responsible. The question now was whether prosecutors could successfully convict not just those who had physically committed the murders, but also Charles Manson himself, who had not been present at either crime scene, but who had orchestrated the violence. The trial, justice and spectacle. On November 18, 1969, the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office assigned Vincent Bugliosi to be the lead prosecutor in the Tate LaBianca murder case. Bugliosi was 35 years old and had an impressive record, having won 103 out of 104 felony jury trials. He was known for his meticulous preparation, his courtroom presence, and his ability to present complex cases in ways that juries could understand. The Manson case would be the biggest of his career, a trial that would test every skill he had developed and that would require him to prove something unprecedented, that a person could be guilty of murder even though he had not been physically present at the crime scenes. The legal challenge was significant. Under California law at the time, a defendant could be convicted of murder if they had aided and abetted the crime, or if there was a conspiracy to commit murder, and the defendant's actions constituted an overt act in furtherance of that conspiracy. Bugliosi would need to demonstrate that Manson had not just suggested or encouraged the murders, but had specifically ordered them, and that his control over his followers was so complete that his orders constituted the same legal culpability as if he had committed the acts himself. Bugliosi threw himself into preparing the case. He interviewed witnesses, studied the crime scene evidence, and most importantly, he worked to understand Manson's psychology and the dynamics of the family. He visited Spahn Ranch and Barker Ranch, seeing the places where Manson had held court and where his followers had lived under his control. He interviewed family members who had not participated in the murders, but who could provide insight into Manson's teachings and the atmosphere he had created. Through all of this work, Bugliosi developed the theory that would become the centerpiece of his prosecution: that Manson had orchestrated the murders as part of an attempt to trigger an apocalyptic race war he called Helter, Skelter. The Helter-Skelter motive was controversial from the start. Some people, including some involved in the defense, argued that it was too bizarre to be credible, that no jury would believe that someone could commit murder based on messages they believed they heard in Beatles songs. But Bugliosi understood that the motive did not need to make sense to normal people. It only needed to be what Manson actually believed, and what he had convinced his followers to believe. The testimony of Paul Watkins and other former family members, who described in detail Manson's obsessive interpretation of the White Album and his prophecies about the coming race war, would provide compelling evidence that this was indeed what Manson had been preaching. The trial began in June 1970 and would last for 9.5 months, making it one of the longest criminal trials in American history at that time. The defendants were Charles Manson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, Leslie Van Houten. Charles Watson would be tried separately after his extradition from Texas was delayed. The trial took place in Department 104 of the Los Angeles Superior Court, with Judge Charles Older presiding. The courtroom was packed with reporters, spectators, and curious onlookers who wanted to witness what had become a national spectacle. From the beginning, the defendants made clear that they had no respect for the court or the legal process. They arrived at the courthouse singing Manson's songs, and in the courtroom itself, they engaged in bizarre behavior designed to disrupt proceedings and draw attention. When Manson carved an X into his forehead, claiming he had X'd himself out of society, the 3 women defendants immediately did the same. Later, Manson would transform the X into a swastika, further signaling his contempt for conventional values and his embrace of symbols associated with evil and hatred. Judge Older struggled to maintain control over the courtroom. The defendants interrupted proceedings, made outbursts, and attempted to turn the trial into a platform for Manson's teachings. At various points, all 4 defendants were removed from the courtroom for their behavior, though they were allowed to return after promising to conduct themselves appropriately. The disruptions were calculated, part of Manson's strategy to maintain control over his followers and to demonstrate that he was unbowed by the legal system arrayed against him. The prosecution's case unfolded methodically over many weeks. Bugliosi presented forensic evidence from the crime scenes, establishing the brutality of the murders and connecting physical evidence to the defendants. He called witnesses who testified about the defendants' presence at Spahn Ranch and their behavior before and after the murders. He presented testimony about the Hinman murder, showing the pattern of violence that preceded the Tate and LaBianca killings. But the centerpiece of the prosecution's case was the testimony of Linda Kasabian. Over 18 days on the witness stand, Kasabian described what she had witnessed on the 2 nights of murder. She recounted driving with the others to Cielo Drive, waiting in the car while hearing the screams from inside the house, seeing the killer's return covered in blood. She described the second night, when Manson himself had come along and entered the LaBianca home to bind the victims before leaving others to kill them. Her testimony was devastating because it came from someone who had been there, who had been part of the family and had believed in Manson, but who had been so horrified by what she witnessed that she had fled and was now willing to testify against her former companions. The defense attempted to discredit Kasabian, arguing that she was the real mastermind and was testifying against the others to save herself. They pointed to the fact that she had been granted immunity and suggested that she was an unreliable witness because of her drug use and her involvement with the counterculture. But Kasabian's testimony held up under aggressive cross-examination. Her account was consistent with the physical evidence and with the statements other family members had made. Perhaps most importantly, her emotional responses when describing the murders came across as genuine. This was not someone boasting about violence, as Atkins had done in jail. This was someone traumatized by what she had witnessed and desperate to help hold those responsible accountable. Paul Watkins, a former family member who had been close to Manson but had not participated in the murders, provided crucial testimony about the Helter-Skelter philosophy. He described in detail how Manson had interpreted the Beatles' White Album, how he had prophesied a coming race war, and how he had told his followers that they needed to trigger that war by committing murders that would be blamed on black militants. Watkins' testimony established that Manson had not just vaguely talked about violence, but had a specific plan and a specific motivation for the crimes. Deprived, the defense called few witnesses, relying primarily on attempting to undermine the prosecution's case rather than presenting an alternative theory of what had happened. Manson himself testified, but only outside the presence of the jury, to avoid potential legal complications regarding statements that might implicate his co-defendants. In his testimony, he portrayed himself as a misunderstood figure, someone who had preached love but whose followers had misinterpreted his words. He claimed that Helter-Skelter was just a word meaning confusion and denied ordering any murders. But his testimony was rambling and at times incoherent, and it did little to help his cause. On January 25, 1971, after deliberating for 9 days, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all counts for all 4 defendants. Each was convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder for the deaths of Sharon Tate, Jay Sebring, Abigail Folger, Wojciech Frykowski, Stephen Parent, Lino LaBianca, and Rosemary LaBianca. The convictions were a victory for the prosecution and for the families of the victims, confirmation that the legal system could hold accountable even those whose crimes seemed to defy conventional understanding. The penalty phase of the trial began immediately after the verdicts. The jury heard testimony about the impact the murders had on the victims' families and about the defendants' lack of remorse. The defendants continued their disruptive behavior, showing no sign that they understood the gravity of what they had done or that they felt any regret for the lives they had taken. On March 29, 1971, the jury returned with the harshest possible sentence: death for all 4 defendants. They would be sent to death row to await execution. Legal landscape was changing. Opposition to the death penalty was growing, and in 1972, California Supreme Court ruled in People v. Anderson that the death penalty as then constituted was unconstitutional under the state constitution. All death sentences in California, including those for Manson and his followers, were automatically commuted to life in prison with the possibility of parole. The defendants would spend the rest of their lives behind bars, but they would not be executed. For some people, including families of the victims, this was a bitter disappointment, a sense that ultimate justice had been denied. For others, it was appropriate, a recognition that state-sanctioned killing was not the answer to violent crime. The victims remembered. With attention paid to Charles Manson and his followers, it is essential to remember that this case is fundamentally about the victims, about the people whose lives were stolen by senseless violence. Their names deserve to be spoken, their stories deserve to be told, and their humanity deserves to be honored far more than the infamy of those who killed them. Sharon Tate was 26 years old when she died, 8.5 months pregnant with her first child, a son she and Roman Polanski had planned to name Paul. She had been born in Dallas, Texas, the daughter of an Army intelligence officer, and had grown up moving frequently as military families do. She had begun modeling as a teenager and moved into acting, appearing in small television roles before landing her breakthrough part in the film Valley of the Dolls in 1967. The role made her a star, and led to comparisons with Marilyn Monroe for her beauty and screen presence. But those who knew Sharon Tate personally described someone very different from the sexpot image her film role had created. She was kind, gentle, and devoted to her family and friends. She was excited about becoming a mother and had been preparing the nursery in the Cielo Drive house for her baby's arrival. She had lunch with friends on the day of her death, talking about her pregnancy and her hopes for the future. Her sister Deborah, who was only 16 years old when Sharon was killed, would spend the rest of her life working to preserve her sister's memory and to ensure that her killers never received parole. The trauma of receiving the news, of watching her mother collapse in grief, of having to identify Sharon's belongings, shaped Deborah's entire life. Jay Sebring was 35 years old, a self-made entrepreneur who had revolutionized the men's hairstyling industry. Born Thomas John Coomer in Alabama, he had moved to Los Angeles and opened a salon on Fairfax Avenue that became the go-to place for male celebrities who wanted sophisticated styling rather than the basic cuts available at traditional barbershops. He counted Frank Sinatra, Steve McQueen, Paul Newman, and Warren Beatty among his regular clients. He had also developed a line of men's hair care products that were commercially successful. Sebring had dated Sharon Tate before she met Roman Polanski, and though their romantic relationship ended, they remained close friends. He was at the house on Cielo Drive that night because he cared about Sharon and wanted to keep her company while her husband was away. According to witness accounts, he tried to protect her when the killers entered, stepping forward to shield her, and he was shot and stabbed for his courage. His nephew, Anthony DeMaria, who was just a young boy at the time of the murder, would later become an advocate for victims' rights, working to ensure that Sebring's memory was honored and that his killers remained behind bars. Abigail Folger was 25 years old, the heiress to the Folger coffee fortune and the great-granddaughter of the company's founder, James A. Folger. But she was not simply a wealthy socialite. She had graduated from Radcliffe College and worked as a social worker in the impoverished Watts neighborhood of Los Angeles, dedicating herself to helping others. She was also active in civil rights causes and had supported various charitable organizations. She was intelligent, compassionate, and committed to using her privilege to make a positive difference in the world. Folger had been dating Wojciech Frykowski, and the two were staying at the Cielo Drive house as guests of Sharon Tate and Roman Polanski. On the night of the murders, she tried to escape, making it outside onto the front lawn, but Patricia Krenwinkel chased her down. Folger's mother, Inez, and her father, Peter, were devastated by her death. Inez would testify during the penalty phase of the trial about the impact of losing her daughter, describing the hole that could never be filled in their family. Wojciech Frykowski was 32 years old, a writer and aspiring filmmaker from Poland who had been a friend of Roman Polanski since their school days together. He had moved to the United States hoping to break into the film industry and had been working on screenplays. He was staying at the Cielo Drive house while looking for a place of his own. During the attack, he fought back ferociously, managing to free himself from his bindings and making it outside. But Tex Watson pursued him and shot and stabbed him multiple times on the front lawn. The autopsy would show that he had been stabbed 51 times, shot twice, and beaten over the head 13 times, evidence of how desperately he had tried to survive and how merciless his attackers had been. Stephen Parent was the youngest victim, just 18 years old, a recent graduate of Arroyo High School in El Monte, California. He had no connection to the people in the main house and was at the property only because he had been visiting William Garrettson, the caretaker, hoping to interest him in buying a clock radio. Parent had stopped by after leaving his job at a stereo shop. He was shot 4 times by Tex Watson as he was leaving the property, killed simply because he was there. His parents, Wilfred and Juanita Parent, were ordinary working people who had raised their son to be responsible and hard-working. They were left to mourn a young man who had his whole life ahead of him, and who died for no reason other than terrible timing. Lino LaBianca was 44 years old, a successful businessman who had worked his way up from modest beginnings to become president of a chain of grocery stores. He had been married once before and had children from that marriage, whom he remained close to. He was described as a kind and generous man who treated his employees well and was active in his community. On the night of August 10th, 1969, he and his wife, Rosemary, returning from a trip to Lake Isabella, driving home to their house on Waverly Drive, when they walked into the nightmare that Charles Manson had prepared for them. Rosemary LaBianca was 38 years old, an intelligent businesswoman who owned and operated Boutique Carriage, a dress shop on North Figueroa Street. She had a daughter from a previous marriage and had been married to Lino for several years. Neighbors and friends described the couple as devoted to each other and active in their church and community. The randomness of their selection as victims, the fact that they were targeted simply because Manson happened to direct his followers to their address, added to the horror of their deaths. They had done nothing wrong, had no connection to Manson or his grievances, yet they died because a madman wanted to create chaos. Gary Hinman, though not technically part of the Tate LaBianca murders for which Manson and the others were tried, deserves to be remembered as well. He was 34 years old, a music teacher with a PhD from UCLA, a gentle soul who had befriended some of the family members and had tried to help them. He allowed them to stay at his home in Topanga Canyon when they needed a place to crash, and he played music with Bobby Beausoleil. His kindness was repaid with violence when Manson sent people to his home to rob him of money he did not have. He was held hostage for 2 days, tortured, and finally murdered, his face slashed and his chest stabbed. His body was discovered on July 31st, 1969, 10 days before the Tate murders. These were the victims. 9 lives ended violently, and 1 unborn child who never had the chance to draw breath. They were not symbols or statistics. They were human beings with families who loved them, with friends who cherished them, with dreams and plans and futures that were stolen from them. Any examination of the Manson case that does not center their humanity and their loss is incomplete. Their names deserve to be remembered long after Charles Manson's name has been forgotten. Perpendicular, of the victims were left to cope with grief that is difficult for anyone who has not experienced such a loss to fully comprehend. Doris Tate, Sharon's mother, became one of the most prominent advocates for victims' rights in America. She attended every parole hearing for the killers, making statements about the impact of her daughter's murder and arguing that they should never be released. Her advocacy helped inspire changes in California law that gave victims' families more rights to participate in the criminal justice process. When Doris Tate died in 1992, she was recognized by President George H.W. Bush as one of his 1,000 points of light for her work on behalf of crime victims. The death of the 60s. The impact of the Manson murders extended far beyond the grief of the victims' families and the conviction of the perpetrators. These crimes became a cultural watershed, a moment when America's understanding of itself and the era it was living through underwent a profound shift. The murders came to symbolize the dark underbelly of the counterculture movement, the point at which the idealism of the summer of love curdled into something horrifying and violent. Writer Joan Didion, who had lived in Los Angeles during this period and who knew some of the people in the Hollywood community affected by the murders, wrote one of the most quoted assessments of their cultural significance. In her essay collection, The White Album, she stated that many people she knew believed that the 1960s ended abruptly on August 9, 1969, ended at the exact moment when word of the murders on Cielo Drive traveled like brushfire through the community. The tension broke that day, she wrote, and the paranoia was fulfilled. This idea that the murders marked the death of the 60s became almost immediately accepted as truth, repeated in countless articles and books and documentaries over the decades that followed. But the reality was more complex than a single dramatic turning point. The counterculture movement had already been showing signs of strain before August 1969. The optimism of the Summer of Love in 1967 had given way to increasing political radicalization, particularly around opposition to the Vietnam War. Urban riots had torn through American cities. The assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy in 1968 had created a sense that violence was spiraling out of control. Drug use, which had initially been framed in terms of consciousness expansion and spiritual exploration, was increasingly leading to overdoses and addiction. Nevertheless, the Manson murders played a crucial role in crystallizing these anxieties and making them concrete. The hippies had promised peace and love, communal living and spiritual awakening, but here was a group that looked like hippies, that had lived communally and taken drugs and rejected mainstream society, and they had committed acts of savage brutality. The murders provided ammunition for those who had always been skeptical of the counterculture, who had argued that rejecting traditional values and authority would lead to chaos and moral collapse. For many parents who had watched with concern as their children grew their hair long and talked about dropping out, the Manson murders seemed to validate their worst fears. Patriotic coverage of the case played a significant role in linking Manson and the family to the broader hippie movement. Newspapers ran headlines like, "Hippie clan is suspect in killing Sharon Tate," and television news programs featured images of Manson and his followers looking like archetypal counterculture figures with their long hair, casual clothing, communal lifestyle. The fact that they had lived at Spahn Ranch, a place associated with the old Western mythology of America, and that they had been part of the Haight-Ashbury scene during its heyday, made them seem like quintessential products of the era. Disregard, many people involved in the counterculture movement, pointed out that Manson and the family were not representative of what that movement stood for. They were an extreme aberration, a cult that had perverted the ideals of peace and community into something monstrous. Manson had not embraced the counterculture's values. He had exploited them for his own purposes, using the language of love and freedom to manipulate vulnerable young people. The fact that he had been an ex-convict with a lifetime of institutionalization before he ever entered the Haight-Ashbury scene suggested that his violence came not from hippie ideology, but from his own damaged psychology. Still, the damage to the counterculture's image was done. The Manson murders cast a long shadow over the movement, making it harder for people to embrace the idealistic vision of communal living and consciousness expansion without worrying about where it might lead. Combined with other events of that period, including the disastrous Altamont Speedway concert in December 1969, where a member of the audience was killed by Hell's Angels who had been hired as security, the murders contributed to a sense that the dream was over, that whatever promise the 1960s had held had been betrayed or lost. The impact on Hollywood was particularly pronounced. The entertainment industry, which had been increasingly open to countercultural themes and had produced films that questioned authority and celebrated rebellion, pulled back. Security became a paramount concern. The casual openness of Hollywood parties and the willingness of celebrities to mingle with hangers-on and admirers disappeared, replaced by gates, bodyguards, and carefully controlled access. The murders had shown that fame could not protect you, that wealth and success made you a target rather than keeping you safe. That self became a media and television news programs. Vincent Bugliosi's book about the case, Helter, Skelter, published in 1974, became the best-selling true crime book of all time, with over 7 million copies sold. The book's detailed account of the crimes, the investigation, and the trial brought the case back into public consciousness and ensured that Manson's name would remain familiar for generations. The case inspired countless other books, documentaries, films, and even rock songs, cementing its place in American popular culture. But this cultural fascination came at a cost. Charles Manson became a celebrity, someone whose name was instantly recognizable and whose image was widely reproduced. He received thousands of letters in prison from people who were drawn to his notoriety or who saw him as some kind of countercultural martyr. This celebrity status, which Manson clearly enjoyed and cultivated through interviews and correspondence, seemed deeply unjust to the families of the victims, who had to watch as the man who had orchestrated the murders of their loved ones became a cultural icon. The case also contributed to changes in American attitudes toward criminal justice and victims' rights. The intensive media coverage of the trial and the public's fascination with the case helped drive support for policies that would give crime victims and their families a greater voice in legal proceedings. Doris Tate's advocacy work, inspired by her daughter's murder, contributed to the passage of California's Victims' Bill of Rights and influenced similar legislation in other states. The idea that victims and their families deserved to have their voices heard, particularly during parole hearings, gained broad acceptance in the years following the Manson trial. The murders also influenced how law enforcement and society thought about cults and charismatic leaders. Before Manson, the concept of a destructive cult was not widely understood by the general public. The case demonstrated how ordinary people from stable backgrounds could be drawn into a group and gradually indoctrinated to the point where they would commit acts they would never have considered otherwise. This understanding would become relevant again in cases like Jonestown in 1978, where over 900 members of the People's Temple died in a mass murder-suicide, and in numerous other cult-related crimes in the decades that followed. Behind bars and parole hearings. After the commutation of their death sentences to life with the possibility of parole in 1972, Charles Manson and his followers settled into the reality of long-term imprisonment. For Manson, prison was familiar territory, a place where he had spent most of his adult life. He adapted to the rhythm of institutional life, and in many ways, he seemed more comfortable behind bars than he ever had been in the outside world. He gave interviews to journalists and filmmakers, always eager to maintain his public profile and to continue the manipulation that had defined his life. In these interviews, Manson presented himself in various ways depending on his audience and his mood. Sometimes he played the misunderstood philosopher, speaking in riddles and suggesting that his words had been misinterpreted by his followers. Other times, he embraced his notoriety, cultivating an image as society's ultimate outcast, the man who had X'd himself out and who represented everything mainstream America feared. He transformed the X he had carved into his forehead during the trial into a swastika, adding another layer of shocking symbolism to his public image. Crowned the swastika was a deliberate provocation, a symbol chosen for its power to disturb and offend. Manson claimed at various times that it represented different things: rejection of society, solidarity with prisoners, or simply a desire to be left alone. But its primary function was to keep him relevant, to ensure that he remained an object of fascination and fear. He understood that as long as people were paying attention to him, he had a kind of power, even from inside a prison cell. The three women who had been convicted with Manson in the original trial also adapted to prison life, though their paths diverged in some ways. Susan Atkins, who had been one of the most vocal and unapologetic killers in the immediate aftermath of the murders, eventually claimed to have found Christianity and expressed remorse for her actions. She married twice while in prison and wrote an autobiography in which she described her time with the family and her gradual realization of the horror of what she had done. She was denied parole 13 times before her death from brain cancer in 2009 at age 61. Patricia Krenwinkel remained in prison for over 5 decades, becoming the longest incarcerated female inmate in the California prison system. She too expressed remorse in later years, participating in educational programs and victim impact initiatives. She was denied parole multiple times, with prosecutors and victims' family members arguing that despite her expressions of remorse, the severity of her crimes meant she should never be released. In 2022, a parole board recommended her release, but California Governor Gavin Newsom reversed the decision, citing the extreme nature of the murders and the danger she might still pose. SpaceX Van Houten's case was somewhat different from the others because she had not participated in the Tate murders and had been brought along for the LaBianca killings by Manson and the others. Over the decades, she became a model prisoner, earning degrees and participating in programs designed to help other inmates. Her lawyers argued that she had been a teenager when she committed the crimes, that she had been under the influence of drugs and Manson's control, and that she posed no danger to society after more than 40 years of rehabilitation. She was denied parole repeatedly, but in 2023, after her 21st parole hearing, she was finally released. Her release was controversial, with victims' advocates arguing that the brutality of the crimes should outweigh considerations of rehabilitation. Charles Tex Watson, who had been tried separately and convicted of 7 counts of first-degree murder, also remained in prison. He claimed to have become a born-again Christian while incarcerated and was ordained as a minister. He married and fathered 4 children through conjugal visits before such visits were banned for lifers in California. He has been denied parole repeatedly, with family members of the victims arguing that his leadership role in the actual killings makes him particularly culpable and that he should never be released. Bobby Beausoleil, who was convicted of the Gary Hinman murder, remained in prison as well, denied parole multiple times despite his claims of rehabilitation and his artistic work while incarcerated. Bruce Davis, who was convicted of the murders of Gary Hinman and ranch hand Donald "Shorty" Shea, was recommended for parole multiple times by the parole board, but each time the governor of California intervened to block his release, citing the severity of his crimes and the ongoing opposition from victims' families. The parole hearings became a recurring source of trauma for the victims' families, who felt compelled to attend and make statements to ensure that the killers were not released. Doris Tate attended every hearing she could before her death in 1992, and her daughters continued this work after her passing. Anthony DiMaria, Jay Sebring's nephew, also became active in attending hearings and speaking against parole. These family members dedicated significant portions of their lives to ensuring that justice was served and that the criminals who had devastated their families remained behind bars. The case took another dramatic turn in 1975 when Lynette "Squeaky" Fromm, a family member who had not participated in the murders but who remained devoted to Manson, attempted to assassinate President Gerald Ford in Sacramento, California. She pointed a loaded gun at the president but was subdued by Secret Service agents before she could fire. She was convicted and sentenced to life in prison, though she was eventually released in 2009. Her attempted assassination, motivated by environmental concerns and her desire to gain Manson's approval, demonstrated that the influence of the family extended beyond the core group of killers and that the threat they posed had not ended with their imprisonment. Charles Manson remained incarcerated at various California prisons for the rest of his life. He was denied parole 12 times, though he rarely bothered to appear at his own hearings or to make any serious case for release. He seemed to understand that he would never be freed and appeared content with his status as a notorious figure. In 2017, at age 83, Manson fell ill and was hospitalized at a facility in Bakersfield, California. He died on November 19, 2017, of cardiac arrest, with respiratory failure and colon cancer listed as underlying causes. He had spent 47 years in prison for the murders, and he died unrepentant, never having expressed genuine remorse for the lives that were taken on his orders. Legacy and lessons. Presumption. More than 5 decades after the murders, the Manson family case continues to resonate in American culture and to offer lessons about the nature of manipulation, the vulnerability of certain individuals to charismatic leaders, and the importance of understanding how destructive groups operate. The case has been studied extensively by psychologists, criminologists, and cult experts who have sought to understand how Charles Manson was able to exert such complete control over his followers, and how ordinary young people could be transformed into killers. One of the key insights from examining the case is the understanding that cult indoctrination is a gradual process, not a sudden transformation. Manson did not immediately tell his followers that they would commit murder. Instead, he built up to it over months and years, gradually breaking down their resistance, isolating them from outside influences, and creating a reality in which his word was absolute. He used a combination of techniques: constant drug use to keep his followers mentally off balance, sexual manipulation to create bonds of loyalty and dependence, isolation from family and friends who might question what was happening, and a carefully constructed belief system that gave meaning to the isolation and hardship they were experiencing. The young women who became Manson's most devoted followers typically had certain characteristics in common. Many came from troubled homes where they had experienced abuse, neglect, or conflict with their parents. They were searching for belonging and acceptance, and Manson provided that, at least initially. They were in their late teens or early 20s, at an age when identity is still forming and when vulnerability to outside influences is particularly high. And they arrived in California during a period of tremendous social upheaval, when traditional values were being questioned and when experimentation was encouraged. Manson understood these vulnerabilities and exploited them ruthlessly. Understanding these dynamics has practical implications for preventing similar tragedies. Parents, educators, and mental health professionals who work with young people need to be aware of the warning signs that someone is being drawn into a destructive group. These signs include sudden changes in behavior, cutting off contact with family and friends, adopting new belief systems that seem to come from an outside source, and showing increasing devotion to a particular leader or group to the exclusion of other relationships. Early intervention, while respectful of young people's autonomy and right to explore different ideas, can sometimes prevent someone from being drawn too deeply into a situation they cannot easily escape. The case also highlights the importance of critical thinking and the dangers of surrendering one's judgment to any external authority. Manson's followers stopped questioning what they were told, stopped evaluating his claims against reality, and accepted his interpretations of events and music and philosophy as absolute truth. This surrender of critical thinking is at the heart of all destructive cults, and teaching young people to think independently, to question authority, and to maintain connections with people who offer different perspectives is one of the best defenses against manipulation. The role of drugs in the family's dynamics cannot be ignored. LSD and other psychedelics were used not for genuine exploration of consciousness, but as tools of control, keeping family members in states where they were suggestible and unable to think clearly. While the counterculture movement of the 1960s often promoted drug use as liberating or consciousness expanding, the Manson case demonstrated how drugs could be weaponized by a manipulative leader to maintain control over his followers. The media's role in creating and perpetuating Manson's celebrity is another important aspect of the case's legacy. By focusing intensively on Manson and treating him as a fascinating subject for books, documentaries, and films, the media gave him exactly what he wanted: attention, notoriety, and a form of immortality. This pattern has been repeated with other notorious criminals, and it raises difficult questions about how to report on such cases in ways that serve the public interest without glorifying the perpetrators or giving them the platform they seek. Perpetrators Bugliosi's book, Helter, Skelter, while providing a comprehensive account of the case from the prosecutor's perspective, also contributed to Manson's celebrity by making him the central figure of a compelling narrative. The book's enormous success demonstrated the public's fascination with true crime and with charismatic criminals, a fascination that continues to drive entertainment media today. But as Bugliosi himself acknowledged, in later editions of the book, there is a tension between educating the public about a case and inadvertently making the perpetrator into a cultural icon. The victims' rights movement that grew in part out of the Manson case has led to important reforms in the criminal justice system. Before this case, victims and their families often had little voice in legal proceedings. They were witnesses for the prosecution, but had no formal right to make statements at sentencing or parole hearings. The advocacy work of Doris Tate and others helped change this, giving victims and their families recognized rights to participate in the process and to have their voices heard. These reforms have made the criminal justice system more responsive to those most directly affected by crime. The case also continues to serve as a cautionary tale about the dark possibilities of charismatic leadership and the importance of maintaining institutional safeguards against abuse. Manson was able to gather and control his followers in part because the permissive culture of the late 1960s made it possible for a group of people to live off the grid, beyond the oversight of authorities who might have intervened earlier. While there are valid concerns about government overreach and the importance of individual freedom, the Manson case shows that some level of social structure and accountability is necessary to prevent predatory individuals from exploiting the vulnerable. The continuing fascination with the case, demonstrated by the steady stream of books, documentaries, and films about Manson and the family, suggests that the case touches something deep in the American psyche. It represents the betrayal of idealism, the perversion of the search for meaning and community into something monstrous. It shows how thin the veneer of civilization can be, and how easily ordinary people can be led to commit extraordinary evil when the right circumstances align. These are uncomfortable truths, but they are truths that need to be remembered and understood. Epilogue. Remembering what matters. Pregnant. As we examine this case more than 50 years after the murders, it is crucial to remember what should be at its center, not the perpetrators, not the notorious cult leader who orchestrated the crimes, but the victims whose lives were stolen, and the families who have carried the burden of grief ever since. The most important names are Sharon Tate, Jay Sebring, Abigail Folger, Wojciech Frykowski, Stephen Parent, Lino LaBianca, Rosemary LaBianca, and Gary Hinman. These are the people who matter, the lives that were lost, the potential that was destroyed. Sharon Tate would have turned 77 years old in 2020. Her son, if he had been born, would be in his early 50s now, perhaps with children of his own. What kind of person would he have been? What contributions might he have made to the world? These are questions that can never be answered, because Charles Manson decided that his delusions mattered more than human life. The same is true for all the victims. We can never know what they might have accomplished, the joy they might have experienced, the people they might have loved, and who would have loved them. That loss is immeasurable. The families of the victims have shown remarkable strength and dignity in the decades since the murders. They have turned their grief into action, working to ensure that the criminal justice system does not forget what was done to their loved ones. Doris Tate's advocacy work transformed the way victims' families are treated within the legal system, giving them rights and recognition they had not previously had. Her legacy extends far beyond her own family, benefiting countless other families who have been affected by violent crime. Deborah Tate, who was 16 when her sister was murdered, has spent most of her life carrying forward her mother's mission, attending parole hearings and speaking out against the release of the killers. Anthony DiMaria, Jay Sebring's nephew, has similarly dedicated himself to ensuring that his uncle is remembered for who he was, rather than simply as a victim of a famous crime. These family members have refused to let the narrative be dominated by the perpetrators, insisting that the focus remain on those who were lost. The case changed American criminal justice in important ways, contributing to the victims' rights movement and influencing how society thinks about violent crime and appropriate punishment. The concept that victims and their families have rights within the criminal justice process, not just during the trial, but throughout the period of incarceration, including parole hearings, gained broad acceptance in part because of the advocacy inspired by this case. These changes have helped make the system more balanced, more humane, and more responsive to those most directly affected by crime. The case also serves as an ongoing reminder of the importance of maintaining healthy skepticism toward charismatic leaders and the need to preserve our ability to think critically even when we are part of a group or community. The young women who became Manson's followers were not stupid or evil by nature. They were vulnerable people searching for meaning and belonging, and they encountered someone who was skilled at manipulation and who had no conscience to constrain his actions. Understanding how this happened, recognizing the warning signs, and teaching young people to maintain their independence of thought are all crucial lessons that remain relevant today. In recent years, there has been increasing recognition that the narrative around the Manson case should focus less on the perpetrator and more on the victims and the broader lessons about manipulation and violence. Documentaries and books that take a more victim-centered approach, that tell the stories of Sharon Tate and the others as complete human beings rather than simply as casualties of a notorious crime, serve the important function of restoring balance to how the case is remembered. The victims were not just names on a list or figures in a crime story. They were people with hopes and dreams, with families who loved them, with futures that should have unfolded over decades. The horror of what happened on those 2 nights in August 1969 cannot be undone. The grief of the families cannot be erased. The cultural impact of the murders, the way they marked a turning point in American consciousness, remains part of history. But how we choose to remember the case, what lessons we draw from it, and whose names we ensure are not forgotten, are choices we continue to make. The most important choice is to remember that this story is fundamentally about loss, about the value of human life, and about the ongoing need to protect the vulnerable from those who would exploit and harm them. Sharon Tate died on August 9, 1969, but her life was not defined by that night. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, a wife, and an expectant mother. She was an actress with a promising career. She was a person who brought joy to those who knew her. Jay Sebring was an entrepreneur and a pioneer in his field, who had built a successful business and who cared about his friends. Abigail Folger was dedicating her life to helping others, using her privilege to make a positive difference. Wojciech Frykowski was pursuing his dreams in a new country. Stephen Parent was a young man just starting out in life. Lino and Rosemary LaBianca were hard-working people who had built a life together. Gary Hinman was a teacher and a kind soul who tried to help others. These are the stories that matter. These are the lives that should be remembered and honored. The legacy of the Manson family case should not be the celebrity of a manipulative killer, but the memory of those whose lives were stolen and the ongoing commitment to justice, to protecting the vulnerable, and to ensuring that such tragedies are prevented whenever possible. That is the lesson that matters, message that should echo through the decades. Remember the victims, honor their lives, and work to create a world where such senseless violence becomes increasingly rare. The house at 10050 Cielo Drive no longer exists. It was torn down in the 1990s, and a new structure was built on the site. The address was changed to 10066 Cielo Drive in an attempt to distance the property from its history. But the memory of what happened there persists, a reminder of a moment when innocence died and when America was forced to confront uncomfortable truths about itself. May we remember it not as the place where Charles Manson made his mark on history, but as the place where Sharon Tate and 4 others lost their lives to senseless violence, where their futures were stolen, and where their families' hearts were broken in ways that could never be fully repaired. In remembering this case, let us commit ourselves to the values that counter the darkness it represents, to the protection of the vulnerable, to the importance of critical thinking and individual autonomy, to the recognition that every human life has inherent worth and dignity, and to the ongoing work of building a society where justice is served, where victims are honored, and where those who would seek to manipulate and harm others are stopped before they can carry out their plans. That is the legacy the victims deserve, and that is the responsibility we carry forward.